you for attending an annual event here at the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center at Stockton University with our friends at Vineland Public Library. And we want to thank our friend Carolyn Frick, our partner at the Vineland Public Library, for inviting us again. I think this is something like the 6th year in a row we have done a program for them. And I want to remind you that there's a wonderful exhibit that is at the Vineland Public Library, focusing on Jewish Heritage Month and focusing on some of the lives of Jewish Holocaust survivors and others that lived in or currently live in the Vineland area. So I encourage you to look on the Vineland Library website and see what their operating hours are, and go on over, say hi to Carolyn, and view the exhibit. Here's a little background about our presentation today. It all began by tracing some of the life stories of our local Holocaust survivors. And one of the things that we learned early on is that many of the survivors we know arrived in the ports of New York City, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. Most of them stayed in this area, in those areas of the cities, and they were able to gain employment in factories or other jobs. But there was one common problem. Knowing the English language was vital for their employment, and there was a high rate of job loss. We often quote George Greenman, who lived on a poultry farm here, not too far from Stockton University, who arrived in New York City, a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and he obtained a job developing film. Now, George had no experience developing film, but he said, "Oh, of course I can do that." He couldn't follow the directions. They were written in English. He ruined many reels of film. You all remember those reels of film where we used to take them to the drugstore to get them developed. And he ran out of the factory shouting, "I quit. The chemicals in Europe are different for developing film." So here's our connection to this story. Our main campus, and I know many of you have, or some of you have never been here, is on 2,000 acres in the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey. We're 15 miles north of Atlantic City. We are in Atlantic County. Nearby is Cape May County, and west is Cumberland County. We're just about 40 miles away from the border of Cumberland and Atlantic counties. And so you see we're surrounded by 3 counties, and today we will focus on Holocaust survivors of Cumberland County, which had rural land, which turned into poultry farms for some Holocaust survivors who had difficulty supporting their families because often, as I explained prior, there was a language barrier to overcome, and chickens could be a solution for this problem. After all, as George Greenman used to say, chickens speak all languages, including Yiddish. In addition, the survivors wanted to live among their own, sharing common experiences of loss and rebuilding families and friends together. Now, fast forward to just about 2 years ago, we had a meeting, our Holocaust Resource Center, and we began to make long-range plans and goals for the future. And we realized we had no organized system or database that had been recorded and available for the next generations after the Shoah, focusing on the Holocaust survivors of South Jersey. So in comes Dr. Michael Hayse, who has been the director of our project. And in addition, there have been well over 200 students, undergraduate and graduate students, who have participated in our project, Holocaust Survivors of South Jersey. And a special shout out to Irvin, who's been our technical person all along, and Matthew Assad and someone who may be with us today, Morgan Everman, who at one time worked on the project through our Holocaust Center. It's truly been a team effort between the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center and our local Holocaust survivors in Cumberland County, Cape May County, and Atlantic County. So today, Dr. Michael Hayse will share one facet of this research. And it's now 4:05, we're right on time. Please use your chat box and submit your questions to Irvin Marino Rodriguez. And at the end, we're going to allow 15 minutes for questions. And Dr. Hayse, as they say, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for showing up. Excuse me. I'm really happy to be here. I know many of you are from Vineland, and I have to say, I'll be talking about sort of some very specific aspects of the work that we're doing. But I'm originally from Kentucky. I actually live in Pennsylvania while I work at Stockton, so I have a long commute. But I feel very much through this research like I've gotten so close to Vineland, because I think must have read thousands of articles in the Vineland Times Journal, what's today the Vineland Daily Times, met with many of you either in person or virtually. And I'm really enamored with the town, with the place, as well as with this history. So again, welcome. I'm really happy to be talking about this. I'm going to share my screen, hoping now that the technology is going to work with us. And Irvin, if you could just confirm that this is going to work when I activate this.
Yes, it works, Dr. Hayse.
Okay, excellent. All right, so for those of you who don't know me, I think I know most of you. I am Michael Hayse. I'm a historian at Stockton. I've been at Stockton since 1996. I work very closely with the Holocaust Resource Center, and more recently, specifically with Holocaust survivors and your families, sort of in this much larger project. We started over 2 years ago in January of 2019 with what I now call the South Jersey Holocaust Survivor Project. And I just want to say a little bit about the larger project before I dive into Vineland. We set as a goal trying to identify all of the stories of all of the Holocaust survivors who settled and lived as a primary residence in Atlantic, Cape May, and Cumberland counties. When we originally started, I figured that we were talking about maybe a few hundred names and individual stories. I was surprised at how quickly, as we started to sort of unravel sort of the history and go through various different processes of trying to identify people, that we were quickly into the several hundred range. And then we passed 1,000. And today, we currently have, as of today, I checked right before we went on, 1,469 Holocaust survivors in our database. And we're by no means, we haven't by any means exhausted all of the different resources. I really think that we're going to have 1,600, 1,700, maybe even more by the time we're done. It's become a massive project, and Gail's already mentioned how many people are working on it. As I see it, this is an important way to record the stories, not just the Holocaust stories of our Holocaust survivors, but what I think is also important, which is the local history, because these were also immigrants. They were people who restarted their lives, American citizens. And that's also something I think really needs to be told, and it needs to be emphasized more than it is, rather than just focusing on what they endured and persevered through during the war, although that obviously is really crucial as well. And perhaps most importantly, it's not just to record it. We're in the process of creating a massive digital archive with records of these Holocaust survivors that will be accessible to visitors at the Holocaust Resource Center, as well as researchers who contact us, who want information about institutions or individuals. But it's also to make it available to the general public as a digital exhibition. right, that we can use as a teaching tool in our pedagogy, both at Stockton University and in our outreach to schools in the area, which is one of the focuses of the mission of the Holocaust, the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center at Stockton, as I think many of you who are familiar with our work already know. I'm going to try to move kind of quickly because I promised Gail that we would leave time at the end. Although most of you are familiar with this geography, we're really looking at those three counties of Atlantic, Cape May, and Cumberland counties. And today we're going to be talking specifically about Vineland in Cumberland County, which is the largest city in the entire three-county region that we're focusing on, right? As I tell many people who don't know this story, it is an unusual one because most Holocaust survivors, when they came to the United States, they went to larger cities like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami. And as you know, South Jersey is a largely rural area. And yet we have this very high number. And like you see, I've got an old number in there, 1,457. We're now at 1,469 Holocaust survivors in our database so far. What brought them here were really the chicken farms, the opportunity of Holocaust survivors, many of whom had arrived from Europe after World War II, having spent years not just surviving under Nazi-dominated Europe, but also as displaced persons for months and often for years before they finally were able to gain sponsorship and get the necessary paperwork and permissions, the visas that were necessary for immigration to the United States. So we're often talking about a long period of time. And when they first arrived, many of our Holocaust survivors, like others, first went to the cities, like New York, like the other places that I've mentioned before, but found that life in the city for one reason or another didn't suit them. They often had the language problems that Gail has already referenced. The opportunities that were available to them were mostly working in factories and small shops, eking out a living, trying to restart their lives. And when they heard about the opportunity to buy poultry farms, sometimes with the support of institutions or fellow survivors or family members, it opened up this realm of opportunity where they could be independent, where they could raise families, because many of our Holocaust survivors, of course, had come to the United States and had young children who were born after the war, either during the displaced persons period in Europe after the end of the war in 1945, or once they arrived in the United States. And so living in a more rural area, independent, was something that appealed to many of them for a lot of different reasons. And here I've got a couple of photos that are not Vineland related. These are ones that I like to show Wolf Ehrlich in Mays Landing, which is in Atlantic County. And in our project, when I started, and we'd often talked about these the Holocaust survivor owned poultry farms, I thought that this was a story really that involved some group that constituted a minority of our Holocaust survivors in our region. And what we have documented is that, in fact, well over half, over 2/3 really of our Holocaust survivors have a chicken farm background. And most of them operated those farms starting in the late 1940s or early 1950s. And it was a period in their lives because chicken farming became less viable, less profitable in the 1950s, and most of them moved on. Some of them stayed in the Vineland area, as many of you know, others did not, right? So that's just this sort of broader background to the story that we're trying to tell. What I'd like to do now is to focus on two Holocaust survivors who have individually and together just an incredible story that represents all of the things I've been talking about, is in its own way extremely inspiring. And these are Irvin and Esther Robb. Both of them were born in Poland in the 1920s. And so I'm going to talk about them, and then we'll move on. And I have a few other things to say at the end. And then we have some time at the end, as we said, for questions and discussion. So Irvin Robb was born Itzhak Marko Robb, R.A.B. rather than R.A.A.B. in Chelm, Poland, to Abraham and Birna Robb. He had 4 brothers. He had a sister. His family was financially well off because his father owned a grain mill. When he was young, the family moved from the smaller city of Chelm to the much larger capital of Poland, Warsaw, which is where they were when the Germans invaded in 1939. At the time, Irving was 21. When the Germans invaded, as Jews in Poland recognizing the dangers, Irvin and his Irvin escaped eastward, like many, trying to avoid the advancing German army, and ended up in Soviet-occupied eastern Poland, where he found work of various sorts, including digging ditches, among other things. And when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union 20 months later in 1941 through eastern Poland, Irving first went into hiding for a brief period, and then he continued that journey east to escape the German dragnet. He joined up with some Russian soldiers who were retreating to the east. He eventually reached the Russian city of Saratov, where he found work in a grain mill of all places, right, where he had special expertise. And the owner of the grain mill eventually sent him in 1942, sent him to another grain mill, to work in another grain mill, which was in Kyrgyzstan in the Soviet Union, one of the Soviet Socialist Republics of the Soviet Union. And even there was concern about safety in 1942 when the Germans advanced towards Stalingrad. At that point, Irving decided to leave the mill. He went to the city of Osh, further eastward, where he worked for yet another grain mill until the end of the war in 1945. So that was his story. At this point, Irving and Esther had not yet met. That's coming up. Just a moment, if I show you here on the map, this is where Chelm is located, all right? And Esther was also born in Chelm, even though the two didn't know each other in Chelm. They weren't, shall we say, together yet in Chelm. And what you see here on this map, the red indicates the borders of Poland between the two world wars. And as you can see, Chelm is located in eastern Poland, east of Lublin. But at the time, it wasn't as far east as it is now. These other lines, these gray lines that you see, represent today's borders. So that where Chelm is located, it's still in Poland, but it's just over the border from the Ukraine, and not far away from the border of Belarus up there to the north, right? Sorry, I should have been moving ahead here to begin with, right? I already told you Irving's story. Esther's father was murdered by the SS when the Germans invaded in 1941. It was a typical and horrific story. The Germans first moved in into the city of Chelm in October of 1940. The SS ordered all Jews living in the town to assemble in the town, all Jewish men living in the town to assemble in the town square, and they proceeded to execute the men that had assembled. It's at that point that her father was murdered. Her brother, Edel, who was also taken at the square and marched out to be executed, was able to feign death. He simply fell to the ground when the shooting started, but he survived. And once the SS was no longer around at the mass gravesite, he left. He returned to his home, to his mother and to his sister. And later in 1940, the three of them were moved into the newly created Helm ghetto. And then from there to a different ghetto in a nearby town. And from there, Esther and Edel were separated from their mother and sent to a labor camp in 1942. And then she was sent to the Sobibor death camp. Now, I need to say a little bit of something, about the Sobibor death camp. For those of you who aren't familiar with the history, Sobibor was one of several camps that were the Nazi death camps that, unlike Auschwitz, which is much more familiar, were exclusively death camps. The only purpose for them to exist was as part of the program, the Nazi so-called final solution to murder Jews. And so Sobibor was, like Treblinka, one of those sites where nobody was supposed to survive. The only people who survived initially, who weren't sent straight to the gas chambers upon arrival, were those who were sorted out for slave labor, for various different kinds of labor, operating the systems that were necessary to support the SS and the killing operations. And even those so-called Sonderkommandos were regularly sort of executed themselves and replaced with others. Esther was one of those who was separated out from the others and made to perform slave labor at Sobibor. What makes this story really unusual, and I think that many of you are familiar with this part of the story, is that Esther was one of a small group that participated in a really daring revolt that took place on October 14th of 1943. It was one of the only revolts that took place and then succeeded also to, at least partially succeeded, several German SS guards were killed in this uprising at Sobibor. And Esther was one of a group of those who were able to escape out of Sobibor, weren't shot or killed or caught and then killed. And with a small group of Jewish survivors who had participated in the revolt, Esther made her way into the woods. They found shelter. They were given shelter by a Catholic Pole by the name of Stephen Marciniuk, who helped to supply them, keep them alive in his barn. It was while she was in hiding in the woods that Esther was also reunited with her brother. And again, I say this very quickly because time is very limited, but I have to stress how absolutely out of the ordinary, unusual, unique both the revolt was, and the fact that Esther was one of those few that survived. And in fact, I'll show you that because it was so unique and unusual, and is also a really dramatic story as well, it has been recorded in that story has been recorded in a variety of different ways. So both Irving and Esther were able to survive. After the war, they returned to Helm. Both of them, I'm sorry about the typo there, I see. Both of them looking, as most Holocaust survivors did after liberation, for family members who might have survived. And of course, they discovered that very, very few members of their family, in fact, did. From there, that is also where they met. And from there, the two of them went to Germany, which was also sort of the typical story. It seems unusual, the Germans having caused, sort of initiated and implemented the final solution and been responsible. It became the place of refuge after the war, especially for Eastern European Jews who had survived and found nothing to return to where they were from. So such was the case with Esther and Irving. And also, because there were rising dangers of Poles who were violently attacking Jews in Poland after the war. There's a very notable pogrom that took place in the Polish city of Kielce in 1946 that resulted in 32 Jews who'd been able to survive the Holocaust being murdered by Polish locals who attacked them where they were staying in that city of Kielce. And these stories, as well as for some, the concern about the tightening control of the Soviet Union, which had sort of quote unquote liberated Poland, but by 1946 and 1947 was beginning to impose sort of Soviet, the style policies that would increase as the Cold War sort of emerged in the post-World War II period. So after the war, they met, they went to Germany, and it was in Germany that they married in the Berlin area and made immediate plans to move to the United States. That was their goal, was to get to the United States. However, in late 1946, Irving was arrested by Soviet occupation authorities who claimed that he was a British spy. And he spent many, many months in multiple prisons, enduring hard labor. Toward the end of his period in the prisons, he worked as an interpreter and as a bookkeeper for his captors. Esther doggedly attempted to get him released and eventually was able to bribe one of the Russian guards that enabled Irving to get released in 1949. And it was after that they immigrated to the United States, and ultimately in 1951 came to Vineland, where they bought a chicken farm. So one of the things I wanted to highlight here is that just a few of the documents of the sort that we've been gathering as part of our digital archive through a variety of different sources. What you see here is a displaced persons card. When survivors, not just Jewish survivors who were displaced persons after World War II, when they came to Germany or Austria or Italy or one of the other places where there were authorities who were creating these refugee camps, the DP camps, mostly under the auspices of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, or UNRWA, they had to register. And so what you see here is a card that is Irving's DP card. And you can see it's got obviously his name. He's Polish, he's Jewish. He's originally from Chelm, which is where he's born. And it provides here his usual trade. It says here owns a jewelry shop, Polish German. These are the sorts of things that we find that help us to both either corroborate or where we don't have actual testimony from the survivors or family members themselves to piece this together. And this is something that we often find. We find ship manifests, or in this case, a passenger list of displaced persons from the Munich area who were being prepared for a transport to immigrate to the United States. In this case, leaving a group that was leaving Munich on the 30th of October of 1950, and I've highlighted there Esther and Isaac Rob, Polish Jews, with some of the other information that their ultimate destination is New York, right? Check my time here, yep. When they came to the United States, they were soon in Vineland, and I've already explained how many Holocaust survivors end up coming to Vineland. The Robs are a little bit unusual in a variety of different ways, both their wartime experiences, I said, that revolt in Sobibor, which is quite unique. But while we have a lot of, a good number of survivors who didn't just own one poultry farm, but they sometimes owned 2 or even 3, the Robs, according to the information that I've gotten, ultimately owned 4 different Vineland area poultry farms, which they operated apparently with some success because by the 1960s, the sort of family farm poultry industry was really petering out in Vineland and the rest of South Jersey, they transitioned like a small handful, but not that small, a handful of our Holocaust survivors who transitioned into a variety of different businesses. In this case, Irving and Esther became co-owners, founders and owners of the Vineland kosher poultry industry, which is a major poultry processing operation that runs out of Vineland. It actually had a couple of different, or even a few different locations and sites on South Mill Road in Vineland. They founded it in 1964. Here you see one of their advertisements. I've got really lots of documents that we've been able to gather from the newspapers. This is one of the things that we do. But their story is also unique because Irving and Esther Rob and their families, and I know some of their family members are actually joining us today on this Zoom, became important fixtures of the sort of social, cultural, and economic landscape of Vineland and South Jersey more generally. And in particular, I could talk about so much more, it was their contributions to Holocaust remembrance in a variety of different ways that I think deserves to be recognized and discussed. And so that's what I'm going to highlight here. And I'm going to focus on just 2 aspects of this. Oh, there's so many other things that I could talk about that the Rob family has been involved with, and that has, things that have enriched Vineland and sort of the region. One of them, of course, is what I suggested before. It's that there was that unique story of the revolt in Sobibor that was made into a book by Richard Rashka, based very largely also on his discussions and notes speaking with Esther. I should add that she also had testified in some of the post-war trials of Nazis after the war based on her experience, because she was one of the few eyewitnesses to survive from Sobibor. That book that was published in 1983 was made into a major film starring Rutger Hauer, directed by Jack Gold, and later in the 1990s turned into a play, which I know recently I couldn't attend, but was actually performed in Vineland. So that has obviously had an impact far beyond our region. And another thing that I'm particularly very fascinated with, those of you know me know that I've done some work on Holocaust memorials, and is the leading role that Irving and Esther Rob took in establishing a Holocaust memorial in Alliance Cemetery in Norma. And here you see just a couple of photographs that I took when I was there with a bunch of students. And I should add that one of the things that made this particularly memorable for me was that when we were there, just by coincidence, we met Irving and Esther's daughter-in-law and their son at Alliance Cemetery, and they actually walked us through a lot of this. It was just one of those many coincidences that we have as we do our research. If you haven't been there before, I really highly recommend that you not just visit Alliance Cemetery. It's got so much history itself. A very large number of the Holocaust survivors of South Jersey are buried in, like Irving and Esther themselves, at the Alliance Cemetery. But this is also a really interesting and I think extremely well-designed memorial on a variety of different levels. It's a real contribution, as many of you know who are from Vineland. It is also a focal point of Holocaust remembrance services in the Vineland area. So these are, this is just these one family's or two Holocaust survivor stories out of the hundreds that we're gathering. Some of them we have documented very well. Some of them we have relatively little information up until this point. I'm always fascinated to get more. I'm going to wrap this up so that we can leave time for questions. I hope that you're putting your questions into the chat for Irvin so that we can have those conversations. Of the Holocaust survivors in our database so far, currently, as I said before, 1,469, 1,085 of them lived at least at some point in Cumberland County. And a large majority of those were also poultry farmers in the 1940s, 1950s, a few of them before the 1950s. Some came actually before the war as refugees from Nazi Germany and Austria. And then there's some who held on chicken farming into the 1960s and even beyond, although the number that lasted through the 1960s as poultry farmers dwindled substantially. There's so many stories I could tell about Vineland. Many of them are familiar to some of you who've been in the area for a while. That poultry farming history itself, there are whole institutions that were built around poultry farming in 1953 and 1954. There was the Poultry Egg Festival, which celebrated the fact that Vineland was really the egg capital of the eastern United States and certainly the mid-Atlantic in the 1950s. There were organizations like the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, the Poultrymen's Club, the cooperative or wholesale egg distributor, called Vineco, that are just a really important chapter, I think, in our region's history, in Vineland's history very specifically. But there's some other things that I think many of you might not be familiar with. Some of you maybe. One of the things, for example, is the contributions to businesses. The Robs are one example of that. We have so many more. I'd like to give a shout out to my former student, George Quinn, who I believe may be on this Zoom as well, and listening to the presentation. Sorry?
George is with us.
George is with us. All right, because recently, he had completed a project for which he received a Stockton Board of Trustees Fellowship to create profiles of South Jersey businesses owned by Holocaust survivors. We have, I believe it's now 137 or 38 businesses in South Jersey that were owned or are owned by Holocaust survivors. Of those, we have completed profiles of, I believe it's 26 at this time, and more are coming and being worked on as we speak. But there are also some others. There were synagogues. I have other students who are working with me to document the synagogues that were either established by Holocaust survivors in our region, many of them in the Vineland area, as well as synagogues that had a substantial number of members who were Holocaust survivors. And other institutions. I haven't had a chance to work through it yet and to do a write-up on it, but it's certainly coming this year, and that is this, on a Vineland radio station, there was a program, a weekly radio program that was done in Yiddish, which might not be unusual in a place like New York or Chicago, but I'm telling you, in a place like South Jersey, a Yiddish radio program is somewhat unusual. And it seems to have been somewhat of a hit. I could say so much more. There's so much to talk about, but I just wanted to give you a little taste of this. The individual stories themselves are just fascinating. And while I'm going to wrap up now so that we can turn to discussion, one of the things that I'd like to ask you to do is that if you know anybody in the area or who lived in the area who is a Holocaust survivor, then by all means contact us to make sure that that person or those people are in our sites, that we've got them identified in our databases. And if you have more information about them, we'd love to talk to you. We have a huge backlog of people that we would like to do interviews with. Most of these we do by Zoom. So you don't even need to leave home. Anything that you can provide, because we're working on a number of different exhibitions. We're very interested in having people from the community provide us with photographs, documents of various different sorts that we might not otherwise find in the archives and digital databases that we are using for much of our research. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I hope that you've got some questions, that we have something to talk about, and I hope also to see some of you in Vineland.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes. We do have a lot of questions, and I will try my best to work through them. But the number one question we've gotten this afternoon is, how and who should I contact to make sure my Holocaust survivor family from South Jersey are included in this project?
Okay, well, you can do a number of different things. The easiest thing to do is to go to the website of the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center at Stockton University. If you just go to the Stockton University website, there's a search function in there. And if you just type in HRC, it'll take you to the Holocaust Resource Center website. And then you will see a link. There's a little photograph with a title and a link to our project. And there you can read about it, but you can also download contact form to give us a little bit of information, let us know who you are, who you'd like us to know about, that you can provide us information with. That's probably the easiest way, and we will get back to you, right? Sometimes it's taking us a little while because, while I've got several really dedicated and wonderful students who are working with me, and I spend most of my time working on this project myself, it is a lot of work. So if it takes us, a few weeks to get back to you, well, it's not because we've forgotten you. Right. There are other ways as well. I don't mind, Irvin, if you wouldn't mind just putting my email address straight into the chat. Just email me directly. I would love to hear from you. And the third thing is, well, we got a little bit of time. So if you want to ask about specific individuals, then ask away, because I can show you a lot of things, and I can show you our database, our chicken farm map that many of you have already seen. And maybe I'll do that anyway, but I was hoping to do that in response to one of your questions. And so I can look up one of those names if you aren't sure if we know about them yet.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes. The second question that we received is, Dr. Hayes, how did you gather the massive information about Esther and Irving Robb? Is this a method others can use to begin researching their Holocaust survivor families?
Yes. Okay. First, let me talk more generally, and then about the Robbs. Okay. There's a wealth of information about the Robbs because we've got memoirs, we've got the Escape from Sobibor book, but also we have the testimonies, the interviews that were given that are to the good people of the USC Shoah Foundation that have a visual history archive based in California that's all digitized. And so, one of the things that we have done is listen to those testimonies that are the digital testimonies and try to sort of, or the memoirs that have been written or other materials. And then we're trying to write a biographical narrative of all of the Holocaust survivors. Again, massive project, so we haven't done it for everybody. So that's one thing. If they've got a USC Shoah testimony, that's excellent. If they have a memoir, that's also excellent, though, because then it's sort of pre-packaged for you in some ways. Now, USC Shoah, you need a subscription for, so you can't just Google it. You can Google it, but you're not going to actually be able to listen to the interview. But if you're affiliated with Stockton University, we have a subscription. We pay for the subscription. And if you come to if you don't have that, if you're not at Stockton, not affiliated with Stockton, but you want to just come and visit us, you can access that at Stockton. All right. We've also been systematically using Ancestry.com, which is a genealogical database that many of you may be familiar with. Luckily, in the past several years, Ancestry.com has partnered with a number of different institutions, including USC Showa that I mentioned before, so that when we look up names in Ancestry.com, we're sent there, but they also are affiliated now with, for instance, Jewish Gen that collects a lot of information on Jewish genealogy, but among other things, they have gathered together a lot of the information that are the so-called memorial books of towns and cities and villages, the shtetls of Eastern Europe in particular. We check every name at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which has its own archive, and a number of other services. One of the things that has been for Vineland a joy to work with is that with a subscription to newspapers.com, the daily journal, what used to be the Vineland Times Journal until 1988, is online and searchable. So that for those of you who worked on this project, I have several of the students and former students here, it is just a gold mine because it was just an absolutely fabulous paragon of local journalism. Really, I can't stress that enough, how really I'm impressed with the editors with that institution of a local newspaper that covered all sorts of different things and covered them well. And so we can search names, various different terms in the Cumberland County, Vineland area. Also, the Millville Daily is in that database, right? So, for every survivor, we haven't completed that process, but I'd say for more than 3/4 of those who were in, that we know of who were survivors in Vineland or in Cumberland County, we have done that search in newspapers.com, and sometimes we will have, if not dozens, sometimes even hundreds of quote unquote hits. So I'm telling you, one thing I should warn you about though, is that when we do that, it means that every police report that was ever given was reported in the Vineland Times Journal. And so if they were stopped and given a traffic citation or showed up in court, we see that too. And so it's not something we collect. It's not our mission, but that's in there too.
Professor Rosenthal, did you have?
Dr. Hayes, we have a surprise guest today.
Okay.
My friend Barry Cohn, can you say hello to us? The voice of Israel from the Vineland radio station.
Call Israel.
Yiddish?
Yeah.
Sure. Well, when I was in high school, there was the Voice of Israel was an hour-long program. One half of it was in Yiddish, and the other half of it was in English. Mm-hmm. And my Zeta, Abraham Cohen, ran the Voice of Israel with his brother-in-law, Samuel Spain, for many years. I don't know the exact year the Voice of Israel began. I believe it was maybe even the late 30s. I think it's the oldest, it was, when it was running, the oldest continuous Zionist radio program in the country. Sam Spain, Uncle Sam Spain, I know wrote a lot of plays specifically for the Voice of Israel. I remember my mother having a bunch of them, but they've been lost to history. And my friend Joe Finkelstein, Zani Jurista's parents were survivors. Zani changed his name to Stephen.
Right.
Became a bankruptcy attorney. But one year I did it with Zani, one year I did it with Joe, and we would read, old Mr. Klein at the, he had a hardware store in Brotmanville. I would get picked up because at that point, I don't think I was driving yet. And they had clipped the Jewish Telegraphic Agency news and then drive us to WWBZ on South Delsey Drive. And we did the Voice of Israel.
That's interesting.
It was great. It was really, really a lot of fun. And I'm trying to remember the name of the guy who was only a couple of years older than I, and I'm not sure who did the Yiddish program. He was born in the U.S., but maybe you know Professor Hayes. I don't have that name.
Okay,
And
so
I have one other quick comment.
Okay, go ahead.
I read the list of the Pulitzer Prize winning writers today, and one of them was wearing glasses, just like you're wearing, and looks like you. Is there any relationship?
Yeah, it was Josh. Josh won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. We found out yesterday afternoon.
Congratulations to our whole.
Who did?
My son, our son. I think Ronnie may be on.
Yes.
Wow,
Ronnie
congratulations to him. That's great.
Yes, and so that is a grandchild of Holocaust survivors.
Well, you know, that's a great, I'm glad that you bring that up. And there's some things I definitely want to show before we end the call and finish the discussion. So I want to get to that too. But, you know, there's so many sort of plans that I have of parts of the exhibition, you know, stories that we want to tell, many of which still need to get developed. Like I said, the Call Israel, the Voice of Israel is one of them. Although I've collected a lot of the documents already, I just haven't got, usually what I like to do is get the students to do the preliminary research in a draft. It's really great for them. It's great for me because I can't do everything myself. And they learn so much. And I just haven't gotten a student who's yet sort of grasped onto that particular topic. But one of the things that is a sort of a meta topic, and that is and I know this speaks right to many of you, the emphasis that these Holocaust survivors placed on family, first of all, obviously having lost so many family members during the war, it sort of made that a particular emphasis in their lives, but how much they devoted themselves to making sure that their children succeeded, sometimes by putting a lot of pressure on them to work hard and succeed in life. But it was one of their ways of giving back, you know. So you see these people who are, you know, have that sometimes hard scrabble life on the chicken farm, you know, who are sending their kids off to colleges, and so many of them become, you know, doctors, lawyers, business people themselves, and just sort of successful people in all sorts of different ways. It's really an amazing story of kind of resilience and upward mobility, what we call intergenerational upward mobility. So that speaks to that. A great journalist who's the grandson of Holocaust survivors, you know, who came through so much, right, is a story that needs to be emphasized. So I should say, just to be clear, in our Holocaust write-ups, we are very interested in the children of the Holocaust survivors. We're trying to record who the parents were of the Holocaust survivors, often survivors themselves. But we have to draw the line someplace. So we are not looking into the grandchildren. So Stephen, I'm afraid we're not going to be writing up, because we just have to, you know, we have to sort of limit ourselves to not make ourselves too crazy.
Okay, so Dr. Hayes,
Yeah.
I'd like to give the opportunity to Marvin Rapp, who wants to speak to all of us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
Very impressive what you did, Michael. You know, you got the story accurately, and I just want to say that, you know, my parents' story is very unique, but to be candid with you, everybody that is a survivor or a child of a survivor has a unique story too. I mean, I don't want to downplay, you know, that. I mean, each story is amazing, and each story has a life lesson to be learned from it. And consequently, you know, my parents are just one of the people of Vineland who did it, you know. So I just like to say one thing, that you know, the relationship that everybody had in Vineland as a second gen is really amazing. I mean, we're like all like family, you know. It's not like everybody, I mean, we didn't have cousins and we didn't have grandparents. So our parents and their friends became our cousins and our grandparents and our uncles and aunts. And, everybody has like a special relationship, with there. And I just want to say that Vineland was very unique. We had a Jewish beach. We had a place where people went, and even to this day, when I meet people from Vineland, particularly some of the few survivors that are left, it's like really amazing. They're like my parents. It's like it's so weird, like we have this special bond that, when you say you're from Vineland, that we all grew up together. We all swam in the river at the Jewish beach. And, it's just like amazing to me. I don't think there are not many towns in America. I mean, I'm sure there are other Holocaust towns, but where everybody felt like they were part of a family. And a lot of the people here I know from when I see them now, and I also see them when they were young. And I just want to say that Vineland was just a very unique town with a lot of amazing people, with a lot of amazing stories how they survived.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Rubb. Dr. Hayes, I'm going to try to get through the questions as best as possible.
Okay.
Someone from the audience asked, how many organizations helped Holocaust survivors relocate to South Jersey?
Okay, well, relocating South Jersey was a process. There were the big national and international organizations that were helping refugees, especially Jewish refugees in this case, to get out of the displaced persons camps that were, the sort of carpeted occupied, Allied occupied Germany after World War II. And these were, the Joint Distribution Committee, many of you are familiar with. There was the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, Hayse. There was a specific organization that was based in New York called the Jewish Agricultural Society. And we've gotten access to some of their archival records. They gave loans out and offered training in some cases to Holocaust survivors, especially, but also some Jews who were trying to get out of the city, to start agricultural enterprises. And so we have a large number of our South Jersey survivors who received aid from the Jewish Agricultural Society. And I can't emphasize enough, it goes to Marvin's point before about sort of the larger family of the South Jersey area, because one of the ways that there was just a network of survivors who helped each other out. So that there were a lot of loans that were extended both within families and between Holocaust survivor families to help people get started or get them through the hard times. I mean, and again, I'll try to keep this as short as possible, but for instance, in 1954, there was a hurricane that passed through the area, and while the brunt of it went through Pennsylvania, it hit especially Cumberland County particularly hard. There were a lot of the poultry houses, chicken coops that were damaged or just outright destroyed. And that could be devastating, for the families. And there was just a community action to help each other out. And this was also in the mid 1950s when there was already a kind of a squeeze on the profitability of these poultry farms. So there were a number of different organizations. And I haven't even exhausted the list.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes. I know that we don't have too much time left, and I want to be cognizant and respectful of everybody's time here this afternoon. I have a comment here, so many comments. This was an excellent program. Thank you all for attending. We had an excellent audience. We had great questions, and there was great discussion here this afternoon. But please, as a comment, please keep in touch. If you have any questions, I did place Dr. Michael Hayes' email in the Zoom chat, or you can call the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center at 609-652-4699. Once again, our phone number is 609-652-4699. And this program was recorded. It will be uploaded to our Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University YouTube channel. within 1 to 2 weeks. And we would like to thank Matthew Assad for editing the video and closed captioning it for everybody. But again, if you want, we can email you the video, a link to the video when it is published on our YouTube page. And again, you can just call us. And I saw that my director, Gail Rosenthal, placed our phone number in the Zoom chat box. So Dr. Hayes, do you have any concluding comments before we go?
No, I'd like to hear from everybody. In a way, I'm very glad that I didn't show all of my little goodies. You know, many of you have already seen our chicken farm map of South Jersey. I'd love to share that again, but time is short. I'd much rather hear from you and have the discussion. So I'm glad that I decided to leave that out unless somebody wanted to look at it.
Thank you to the Vineland Public Library for inviting us today. For those that are of you who are second generation, whose parents, grandparents, family members were Holocaust survivors, we're having a gathering on Sunday, June the 12th at the Jewish Community Center on Jerome Avenue in Margate. It will be from 10 a.m. to 12 noon. Dr. Hayes will be doing a new presentation, and we will be bringing our students with us with their laptops. So you'll be able to have a private, personal opportunity to meet with a student, and they can show to you the information that we've gathered for your families. So if you don't receive an invitation in the mail, they're going out this week, please contact us. Our phone number is in the chat, 609-652-4699. And the event, again, is for children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and the cost is free. Dr. Hayes, we will let you be the final concluder.
Okay. Again, this is really for me a labor of love. I'm not Jewish myself, as most of you already know, but I'm just so invested in this project and in these communities. I'm just amazed by everything that I learned. As Irvin mentioned, you know, this was just, you know, one story. Every story is so unique and so interesting in its own right, even though very often people don't realize how interesting and unique it is. And as I look across the Zoom now, that I can focus a little bit more, I'm seeing a lot of the names of people whose family members are in our database who I haven't spoken to yet. There are many of you that we have. It is so important for you to talk to us about what your experiences and memories are, because I think that South Jersey story is as important as the Holocaust survivor story. And so please do reach out. Don't be shy, because if you don't, we may end up contacting you at some point. I see that Barbara's on here as well. Barbara Roth has been an indispensable resource. I really, really appreciate everything that you've done, Barbara. One of sort of our eyes and ears in Vineland. All right, so and that's it. Just
let's all wave goodbye to Mike. Thank him, our students that are on, George and others, and all our second, third, and fourth generation. Thank you for joining us. And again, big shout out to Vineland Library. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, Vineland Library.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.